With a smug grin, the security guard swung his nightstick at the quiet veteran. Seconds later, he found himself disarmed and pinned to the marble floor, suddenly realizing he had just attacked one of the most decorated Delta Force operators in military history. The afternoon sun streamed to the grand windows of the Westfield Hotel's luxurious lobby, bathing the marble floors and mahogany furniture in warm golden light. Among the bustling weekend crowd of well-dressed guests and busy staff, one man remained distinctly apart from the rest. James Mitchell occupied a leather armchair in the corner of the lobby's waiting area, his posture relaxed yet somehow alert. One worn military boot crossed over the other. A leather-bound notebook rested open on his lap. His weathered hands moved methodically across the page, writing with deliberate precision. Each word carefully considered, each sentence mapped out with tactical efficiency. He wore a simple olive green jacket, faded from years of use, over a plain gray t-shirt. His well-worn military cap sat low on his brow, casting a shadow over rugged features that had seen more than most could imagine. A neatly trimmed beard streaked with silver framed a face etched with fine lines, not just from age, but from experiences that had shaped him in ways few civilians could comprehend. James Mitchell wrote steadily, occasionally pausing to sip from a paper coffee cup, his focus complete. He was designing a support program for veterans with PTSD, something close to his heart. For a man who had spent decades in constant motion, training, fighting, surviving, leading, this moment of stillness was unfamiliar territory. Yet here in the quiet corner of the hotel lobby, waiting for the veteran support meeting to begin upstairs, he found a rare moment of peace. No missions to complete, no enemies to outmaneuver, just a former soldier with a notebook, working to help those who had walked the same difficult path. And for now, that was enough. Then came the sound. Heavy boots striking against marble, their deliberate cadence cutting through the lobby's refined atmosphere. The footfalls carried the weight of someone who expected others to notice his arrival. Scott Harris strode forward with practiced authority, his private security uniform pressed to perfection. Each brass button gleamed under the chandelier light, the chief of security badge prominently displayed on his chest. His shoulders were squared, his movements calculated to project control and dominance. As he surveyed the lobby, his mirrored sunglasses reflected fragments of the opulent space around him. His hand rested casually on the nightstick at his hip, fingers occasionally brushing against it, a habit that revealed how much he relished its presence. Those who worked at the Westfield knew Scott Harris wasn't simply head of security. He was a man who craved power and control, who viewed the hotel as his personal kingdom. Scott's gaze swept methodically across the lobby, past the reception desk with its efficient staff, beyond the businessmen hunched over laptops, past the families waiting with their expensive luggage. Then his attention locked onto the solitary figure in the corner. Something about the man bothered him immediately. Too still, too focused, too ordinary for such an exclusive establishment. Not a businessman in a suit, not a wealthy guest flaunting designer clothes. Just an older man in worn military gear, taking up space in Scott's perfectly maintained domain. To Scott, there was no justifiable reason for someone dressed like that to be in the Westfield's lobby unless they were delivering something or fixing something. Certainly not sitting comfortably in the premium waiting area reserved for paying guests. Without hesitation, he changed direction and strode toward the corner, each step purposeful and commanding. Several guests glanced up, sensing the shift in energy as the security chief moved with unmistakable intent. "Sir," Scott's voice cut through the ambient chatter, sharp and authoritative. "This area is for hotel guests only." James Mitchell looked up slowly, his pen pausing mid-sentence. His eyes, clear, alert, assessing, met Scott's mirrored sunglasses with quiet acknowledgement. "I'm waiting for the veteran support meeting in the Aurora room at 4, he explained, his voice low and measured. The coordinator said the lobby was fine. Scott's jaw tightened. The veterans event, he'd seen on the schedule but paid little attention. Such gatherings weren't the prestigious clientele the Westfield typically catered to. "Do you have proof you're part of this event?" Scott demanded, not bothering to hide his skepticism. James reached unhurriedly into his jacket pocket and produced a printed email confirmation. Scott barely glanced at it. "I'm going to need you to wait somewhere else. Perhaps the coffee shop across the street would be more appropriate for your attire," Nearby, a couple exchanged uncomfortable glances. A woman at the adjacent table frowned, her gaze flickering between the security chief and the veteran. James closed his notebook calmly. The meeting starts in 20 minutes. I'm not bothering anyone. Scott's patience, thin from the start, began to evaporate entirely. People always move when he told them to. That was how this worked. His authority within these walls was absolute, his word final. With sharp precision, he unclipped the nightstick from his belt and brought it down hard against the marble side table next to James. The crack echoed to the lobby like a gunshot, causing several guests to jump. A crystal vase rattled, water sloshing onto the polished surface. "This isn't a request," Scott said, voice dropping an octave. James Mitchell did not flinch. He didn't jerk back, didn't startle at the sudden violence mere inches from his arm. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, adjusting his military cap just enough to reveal more of his face, weathered, calm, and utterly unimpressed. The movement was deliberate, almost casual, yet something in it sent an unfamiliar sensation crawling up Scott's spine. Not fear, not yet, but something uncomfortably close to uncertainty. The security chief had intended to intimidate, to establish dominance. Instead, he felt a strange shifting of balance he couldn't quite name. Scott's fingers tightened around the nightstick, knuckles whitening beneath tan skin. The lobby had grown quieter, the ambient conversation fading as guests sensed the rising tension. This was no longer just a security check. It had become a test of wills. "Stand up," Scott ordered, voice hard as flint. James sighed quietly. Not with fear, not with anger, but with something that seemed almost like disappointment. He slipped his notebook into his jacket pocket and rose to his feet with fluid economy of movement. Standing, he was neither exceptionally tall nor physically imposing at first glance. Yet something about his posture, balanced, grounded, completely at ease, suggested coiled strength beneath the unassuming exterior. Scott stepped closer, intentionally invading James's personal space. "I want you out of this lobby. Now!" When James didn't immediately move, Scott's control slipped another notch. With practiced authority, he reached out, gripping the veteran's shoulder firmly. The universal gesture of physical dominance. The muscle beneath his fingers was unexpectedly solid, corded with the kind of density that comes from decades of functional strength rather than cosmetic fitness. Before Scott could process this observation, his wrist was caught. The movement wasn't aggressive or violent. It was smooth, precise, almost gentle. James's hand simply closed around Scott's wrist, applying the slightest pressure at exactly the right point. "Don't touch me, please," James said quietly. Scott tried to pull his arm back, surprised when the grip released immediately. There had been no struggle, no contest of strength. Just a clear message delivered with minimum necessary force. For the first time in years, Scott felt his absolute authority questioned, not with words or complaints that could be dismissed, but with calm, irrefutable competence that left no room for debate. The security chief's face flushed hot with humiliation. Guests were watching now, some openly staring, others pretending not to notice while stealing glances. His reputation, his authority, both were on the line. Scott raised his nightstick deliberately, no longer concerned with hotel policy, about use of force. This wasn't about procedure anymore. It was about proving who was in control. He swung the nightstick in a practiced arc aimed at the veteran's shoulder, not to injure severely, but to subdue, to force compliance through pain and shock. James moved, not in panic, not in fear, but with the fluid precision of someone who had faced far worse than a hotel security guard with an inflated ego. A subtle shift of weight, a small turn of his body, and the nightstick cut through empty air, finding no target. Before Scott could recover his balance, James's hand was on his wrist again, applying precise pressure to specific nerves. The nightstick slipped from suddenly numb fingers, clattering to the marble floor with a sound that seemed to echo through Scott's embarrassment. James didn't grab the weapon. He simply let it fall, then took a step back, creating distance, de-escalating the situation with the practiced ease of someone trained to manage far more dangerous confrontations. Scott stared at his fallen nightstick, his breath coming faster, his mind struggling to process what had happened. He had trained in defensive tactics, had subdued drunk guests and aggressive trespassers. Yet this older man had disarmed him with such ease it seemed almost dismissive. Nearby, a businessman had pulled out his phone, recording the confrontation. Others were watching openly now, the pretense of disinterest abandoned. Scott could feel their eyes, could sense a shift in how they perceived him. No longer the unquestioned authority, but something far less commanding. "You've made a big mistake," Scott growled, his hand moving to his belt where his taser was holstered. "Last chance to leave before this gets worse for you." James Mitchell remained still, his posture neither threatening nor submissive. His eyes, clear, focused, assessing, tracked Scott's movement toward the taser. "Don't do that," he said simply. The warning carried no threat, no aggression, just the calm certainty of someone stating an obvious fact. But Scott was beyond heeding warnings. His fingers closed around the taser, drawing it from his holster with practiced efficiency. Several guests gasped. A woman pulled her children behind a large column. The businessman with the phone stepped closer, ensuring he captured everything. As Scott raised the taser, James moved again, this time with quicksilver fluidity that belied his age. One moment the weapon was in Scott's hand, the next it was gone, removed with such clean efficiency that Scott didn't even feel it leave his grasp. James placed the taser gently on a nearby table, out of reach. His movements were economical, almost gentle. There was no showmanship, no unnecessary force, just the minimum action required to neutralize the threat. "This needs to stop now," James said, his voice still calm despite everything. Something snapped in Scott Harris. The humiliation, the loss of control, the audience witnessing his failure. It all crystallized into blind rage. With a wordless snarl, he lunged forward, abandoning all pretense of professional conduct, driven by pure instinct to reclaim his shattered authority. James Mitchell had anticipated the attack before Scott's muscles had even tensed to move. 20 years in Delta Force had taught him to read intent in the smallest shifts of body language, to recognize the precursors to violence in the most subtle cues. Scott charged forward, arms outstretched, but the outcome had been decided before he took his first step. With fluid economy of movement, James sidestepped, redirected Scott's momentum, and applied precise pressure to key points. There was no slam, no crash, no violent impact, just the inevitable consequence of physics and expertise. One moment Scott was lunging forward. The next he found himself face down on the marble floor, one arm gently but immovably secure behind him, unable to rise despite his desperate struggling. James applied no more pressure than necessary, enough to immobilize, not to hurt. His breathing remained calm, his movements precise. This wasn't combat to him. It was problem-solving with the minimum necessary force. "What's going on here?" A deep voice cut through the stunned silence of the lobby. William Carson, the hotel's director of security, strode toward them, flanked by two junior officers, tall and commanding, with silver temples and the unmistakable bearing of military experience. Carson took in the scene with one comprehensive glance. "He attacked me," Scott gasped from the floor, struggling ineffectively against James's hold. Carson's eyes moved to James, truly seeing him for the first time. His expression shifted subtly, recognition dawning in his features. "Captain Mitchell?" he asked, voice suddenly hushed with disbelief. James nodded once, still maintaining his hold on Scott with seemingly effortless control. Carson turned to his junior officers. "Take Mr. Harris to the security office." As they helped Scott to his feet, Carson faced him directly. "Your badge and equipment. Now!" "You can't be serious," Scott began, but fell silent at Carson's expression. With trembling fingers, Scott unpinned his security badge and surrendered his equipment belt. The symbols of authority he had treasured now felt hollow in his hands as he placed them in Carson's outstretched palm. After Scott was escorted away, Carson turned to James, extending his hand with profound respect. "My son was in the 101st Airborne in Afghanistan," he explained, voice thick with emotion. "Helmand Province, 2010. He told me how a Delta team led by Captain Mitchell extracted his unit when they were surrounded. I never thought I'd get to thank you in person." James accepted the handshake with quiet dignity. "Just doing our job." Around them, the lobby had returned to its normal rhythm, but something had changed. Guests who had witnessed a confrontation looked at James differently now. Not with fear or curiosity, but with newfound respect. The businessman who had recorded everything approached cautiously. "Sir, I deleted the video. What you did, what you are, that deserves privacy, not viral fame." James nodded his appreciation. As the veterans' meeting time approached, James retrieved his notebook and returned to his seat. The same corner, the same chair, but the space around him felt different now. Not because he had fought, but because he hadn't needed to. True power had never required a uniform, a badge, or a weapon. Scott Harris stood outside on the sidewalk, stripped his authority, finally understanding a fundamental truth. The security uniform hadn't made him powerful. It had merely borrowed power from something larger than himself, something he had never truly understood. Meanwhile, James Mitchell returned to his notes, designing a program to help veterans find peace after war. The most important mission of his distinguished career. Because in the end, protecting people had never been about dominating them. It had always been about serving them.